Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Good to be here.
You know, I want you to first, for our viewers, weigh in on the historic significance of this impeachment and this trial that we're going into.
Well, it's only the third one in American history of a president. There have been lots of others of judges, but it's very rare for a president to be impeached, and it's still rare for a president to go to trial. This is the third one to go to trial. There was Andrew Johnson, there was Bill Clinton, and now President Trump. Of course, Richard Nixon would have been impeached and probably would have been convicted, but he resigned before he was impeached. So that's why this is the third rather than the fourth one.
You know, there are some people who feel as though we've been hearing the word impeachment thrown out so much over, you know, his presidency, but to actually have him be impeached is quite, again, it's quite significant.
And I think that was apparent this week because the process begins with a very formal swearing in of both the Chief Justice, who comes over from the Supreme Court and presides over the trial instead of the Vice President of the United States or the President pro tem of the Senate, who would normally preside in normal Senate business. And the senators themselves take a new oath, different from their regular oath of office that they took to become senators. And so this week they did that and televised it. And they not only swore the oath orally, but they each sign a book committing themselves to this new oath to do impartial justice under the Constitution. So it's actually not a legislator's oath. It's an oath for that is similar for the oath for a judge or a juror. And so what that means is that the Senate is remaking itself into a new kind of institution for this specific purpose. And so during the time of the trial, they act differently. For example, they're not allowed to talk to each other. They have to just sit there and listen. And all the normal roles have gone away. The majority leader, minority, they're all equal. And they have to sit there and purportedly just listen to the evidence and try to judge it fairly. That's a big controversy now, as you know, because some of the senators have already begun talking about what they're going to decide before they've heard the evidence. So it raises a very interesting question of what it meant for them to take the oath this week.
Yeah, we're going to get into that a little bit more in just a moment. I want to ask you, you know, the impeachment and the trial, it is part of the architecture for separation of powers in our Constitution, you know, and the impeachment was the first step in the ultimate check, which would be removal from office. And while it's not supposed to be a partisan, you know, thing, it is, especially now.
Right, but the first point that you made is one that most citizens really don't understand, and it's really a good point that you brought up. Impeachment is actually mentioned 6 times in the Constitution, and it's mentioned in each of the articles dealing with the major branches, the Congress, the President, and the Court. So it's woven into the very fabric of the institutional design of the government that we call separation of powers. And the way that it's woven in is it's an attempt to make sure that the advantages that a president has in acting, for example, in responding to threats that might result in war, for which we want a president to be able to act quickly and sometimes without consulting others and so forth. That needs to be balanced somehow in a republic by the legislature that gets to sort of think whether the president acted properly. So the president has a lot of advantages going forward in politics, looking forward, starting things. And the impeachment process was designed to make sure that the Congress had advantages looking backwards, judging things. And so it's really meant to embolden the whole institution of the legislature, the House and the Senate, not so much one party or the other, as against the president, against, again, not so much one particular president or the other, but the presidency is balanced by the Congress. So the impeachment is very, very important to all the other powers that the Congress has. For example, when they ask for information, if it's not possible for a president to be impeached, presidents are never going to give information if there's no consequence for not giving information. So impeachment is really vital to the, as you pointed out, the separation of powers architecture of the government.
And so it seems as though, but now we're in a juxtaposition where the House feels as though he's overstepped those boundaries, or at least the majority in the House, right? The Democratic majority. Whereas we're not seeing that in the Senate. How do you weigh that out?
Well, it's, in my view, it's potentially a breakdown of the constitutional order itself. So, the difficulty is, just to give you a sort of contrasting example, there's a now departed, now deceased senator from West Virginia, Robert Byrd, who at one point was the majority leader for the Democrats. Robert Byrd used to carry the Constitution around in his pocket and sometimes pull it out and read it. And he was known for sometimes both lecturing the president and opposing the president of his own party on policies with which he agreed with the president. He liked the policy, but when the president did things that ran athwart of the processes and procedures of the Senate, for example, if he didn't consult with the Senate Intelligence Committee, or if he didn't provide some piece of information that was required by law or something, Byrd thought that, that upholding the traditions and responsibilities, duties, and powers of the Senate was more important than his partisan views. That's changed in both parties over the course of recent history, and especially in the Republican Party, where we have not just differences of opinion about policy, but what some people would call hyperpartisanship or tribalism. And what that means is that a senator thinks it's more important to stick together and to oppose the party on the other side, even if they propose something that you like, or something you proposed previously, or even if it were something that you would be opposed to if if a president of the opposite party did the same thing. So that's a real potential breakdown in the whole constitutional order itself, that we've come to this point in which people can't see their institutional responsibilities, or even be really committed to the ideas that brought them to Washington, as opposed to the party as a tribe.
Right. You know, we can't talk about impeachment without talking about Alexander Hamilton, and particularly when you're talking about this breakdown in the Federalist Papers, he discusses the greatest fear, and the greatest fear being that people are going to make decisions along those party lines rather than guilt or innocence. And it seems as though we are living out his greatest fear.
Right. Well, that actually wasn't his greatest fear. His greatest fear actually was the problem of demagoguery, which we are also living out. That's a popular leader who stokes passion and creates division on the basis of sort of hateful rhetoric and that sort of stuff. That was his greatest fear. He actually thought that the problem of partisanship was sort of normal for politics, and that's why they actually picked the Senate as the locus for the trial, because they thought that they could actually raise the Senate up to still consider issues politically, which is to say that it's not just a matter of law, but political judgment about whether a president had abused his office, for example, which may not be illegal, but may be anti-constitutional. That's a kind of political judgment that a court can't make. And so he didn't want it in, he argued it shouldn't be in the Supreme Court because they would be possibly undermining their legitimacy for their normal functions. So instead he said, maybe we can make the Senate rise up to the demands of high politics by making it, as I said earlier, into a kind of new institution called the Senate trial with new oath and all that sort of stuff. So that was to respond to something that he didn't think was the worst aspect of politics, but was a typical aspect of politics, that people disagree about things. That's what partisanship is about, and that was something not so much to be worried about, but to be transcended to some degree. What he really worried about, however, was well, just to give you one example, during the Andrew Johnson impeachment, the 10th article of impeachment was for his divisive and hateful rhetoric, attacking his opponents by name, comparing himself to Christ, and calling his opponents Judas and all this sort of stuff. And President Trump is not being formally charged for his abusive rhetoric. So that's not among the two articles. But it actually is much worse than what Andrew Johnson was charged for. And that was, in fact, the nightmare scenario that Alexander Hamilton was worried about.
The trial in the Senate is expected to start on Tuesday, and the most common types of questions I get from viewers are based in the comparison of this trial to a criminal trial that we would see within our judicial system. And that's just not simply an apples to apples comparison.
That's right. That's right. So another interesting point that you're bringing up is that there is a kind of an analogy between this process and what we normally think of as criminal trials. So that the House part of it is similar to, but also a little different to, the grand jury process in a criminal proceeding. And the trial part of it in the Senate is similar to, but also different from, a criminal trial. And so why would that? First of all, it's very, very important that we realize that an analogy is not an identity. It means you're like in some ways and unlike in others, just as you pointed out in your question. And so that raises the interesting question is, why did they use an analogy? Why do they, for example, call the prosecutors managers, not prosecutors? Why do they have? Why do they allow the jurors to overrule the Chief Justice if they disagree with his opinion? If, in fact, they wanted it to be like a criminal trial, they could have said, well, they're prosecutors and they're jurors and so forth. And the answer to that question is that they thought that the pretense, the analogy, could help elevate partisan politics to a higher politics. So it wouldn't be a trial like other trials. It would be a political trial, but it wouldn't be politics as usual. So the analogy is designed to create this high politics, this unusual politics. The problem with it, which I think you might have been intimating in your question, is if you take the analogy too literally, you get people saying things like, well, what crime did he commit? Mm-hmm. If, on the other hand, because it's not an ordinary crime that you need to be guilty of if you're a president. In fact, there are lots of things that if a president did them, if an ordinary citizen did them, they're certainly not illegal. And one of the examples in a famous book on impeachment by a Yale law professor, Charles Black, is imagine that some citizen writes an op-ed that says no Catholic should be appointed to the Supreme Court. That would violate the no religious tests provision of the Constitution. And you might get criticized, but and you might get all sorts of bad critical letters to the editor about that op-ed, but you're not going to jail for saying that. But if a president says right up front, I'm just not doing that, that's a serious violation of their duty as president. And so he uses that as an example of something that wouldn't be illegal, and then if he were removed from office, he couldn't be prosecuted for it, but it would be impeachable. And similarly, presidents might do things that would be illegal for an ordinary citizen. For example, a targeted assassination, which under some circumstances might be justified under our own laws. Others may be not, but sometimes it might be. It's never for an ordinary citizen to do something like that. So the danger is either we over-legalize it, we think of the analogy too literally and do like some of the senators today are doing and saying, well, what crime did he commit? Or you unmask it and say, it's not legal at all, and therefore it's just politics as usual. So it's a kind of unstable architecture, this analogy. You go too much one direction or the other, and what it's designed to do is be a sort of high-toned politics, not something strictly legal, nor something of ordinary partisan contestation.
Yeah. And yet, though, we continue to hear sort of this rhetoric coming from senators, particularly Republicans, who say, oh, but they haven't accused him of committing any crime,
right,
because we hear often that you have to be accused of a high crime or misdemeanor. Right. So explain to us, though, there's some history behind that term.
There is. And so, well, the Constitution says that you can be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And so because it says high crimes and misdemeanors, and people think of both the word crimes, and the notion that misdemeanors are a form of criminal charge in the ordinary criminal code, that they think that what the phrase means is high crimes and high misdemeanors, and they say, what is that? But the whole phrase, high crimes and misdemeanors, was invented in the 14th century in English law to cover abuse of office. And interestingly, at the time, there was no category of misdemeanor. What we now call misdemeanors, which are less than felonies, were then called trespasses. So it was 2 centuries later that they came up with misdemeanors. So the phrase is actually a kind of technical phrase meaning abuse of office. And the way that they came up with it in the United States is that they originally had proposed treason, bribery, or maladministration. And Madison and others said, well, maladministration might be interpreted as just throwing somebody out for a policy dispute that you lost, like a vote of no confidence or something. And we don't want that. We want it to be abuse of office. So they said, well, at the very time they're debating this, Warren Hastings was being impeached and tried in Britain. He was the Governor General of India for abusing his powers. And he was being tried for high crimes and misdemeanors. So they said, that's what we're talking about. And so they took the phrase from there and wedded it to treason and bribery, to replace maladministration, so as to convey the idea that it's about abuse of office, not just a disagreement about whether we should have health care or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Thursday, the members of the Senate took an oath to carry out impartial justice. But as we've kind of been alluding to and talking about, there are Democrats and Republicans who sort of have already drawn their lines in the sand. They said this is the way that they're going to vote. So then in this instance, in a Senate trial like this, what does impartial justice, what does that actually mean?
Well, we know what it doesn't mean. It does not mean coordinating with either the White House, as Senator McConnell has bragged about doing, or for that matter, having the senators, the House managers are perfectly okay to coordinate with Speaker Pelosi, just as the defense attorneys can coordinate with the White House. But the senators are on both sides, shouldn't be coordinating with anybody at this point. So we know it doesn't mean that. That is a violation of the oath to do that sort of thing, even though they've already said they're going to do that. Particularly the Republicans have been most vociferous about their thwarting of the oath. But your question's a good one. So then what does it mean to be impartial? It doesn't mean that you don't have to have any opinions, like you might if you were a regular juror in a regular trial. It doesn't mean that you can't know the parties. It doesn't mean that you have to be sequestered from the news. So what does it mean? It means, I think, it means that you have to imagine, would I make the same decision if the person being charged were a person of my own party? So if you're a Democrat, you have to be willing to say, if Clinton or Obama or some other Democrat were charged with these very same things, would I vote to convict and remove from office? And if you're a Republican, you have to be able to say, can I really say honestly that if Obama were charged with the same things as what we're listening to now, that I wouldn't be calling for impeachment and conviction? Can I honestly say that? That's the question each one has to pose to themselves. That's what it means to be impartial, that I would make the same judgment no matter what the party was of the president.
Interesting. And they will be listening to that testimony because no electronics allowed on the Senate floor as they're listening, right?
There's no electronics, no phones. They do have these pages that come back and forth. So there's been a lot of talk about the pages bringing the president's tweets in little messages, which I think violates the spirit of the thing, but it may actually be technically allowed. So
will be interesting to see.
Right,
Give our viewers some final thoughts as they are going to be watching this happen, watching this unfold, history unfold. What do you think they should keep in mind?
I think that they should be asking themselves, to what extent are the senators themselves thinking about history? So the House managers and the defense attorneys, for that matter, are speaking to three audiences. They're speaking to the senators themselves, they're speaking to the American people, but they're also speaking to history. And one of the most interesting features of our time is the extent to which a lot of senators have not actually asked themselves the question, what do I want history to say? What do I want my tombstone to say? What do I want the obituaries to read like? And I think citizens ought to be asking themselves, what should my senator, what should my representatives be thinking along those lines? What would I think if I were them about how history should read what I do today? Should it be looking at the decision that I'm making in a positive way? Or should I worry about the fact that history is going to see me as some sort of problem for this polity, or somebody that should be that was an embarrassment? What will I think my grandkids and their kids and my family think of what I did at this time? Citizens should ask themselves that question of themselves, and they should ask that question of their representatives.
Thank you so much.
All right.
That's perfect.